There seems to me, you talk about the fact that all the great spies through history have had tough childhoods.
I said, Mr. Ambassador, I'm really sorry, I have to report that I woke up this morning with drugged and I'm feeling with a dreadful headache, and there was this woman lying next to me. But anyway, Trump, yes, sort of got to the stage where he felt he liked Putin and felt he could trump Putin. The reverse was never the case. Putin was much smarter in terms of assessing Trump.
Welcome, my name is Dr. Raj Basood, I'm a consultant psychiatrist, and today I'm talking to the author of this amazing book, The Psychology of Spies and Spying, written by John Taylor and Professor Adrian Furnham. We're going to discuss what the real James Bond actually does and looks like psychologically. So, welcome to the Psychiatric Clinic, John Taylor, author of this very interesting book, The Psychology of Spies and Spying, co-authored with Professor Adrian Furnham, a professor of psychology. I was a student of Adrian's way back in the distant past, which is partially my connection with this amazing book. So first of all, tell us about yourself, John.
Okay, so fairly normal entry into the government, British government civil service. I joined the Foreign Office, Foreign Service really, 50 odd years ago now. Had a full career there. Worked overseas in embassies in Geneva, in Moscow, in Stockholm, and in New Delhi. And then when I retired, as we have to, I set up my own training agency and effectively would have been training intelligence and security services around the world for the last 30 years or so.
So I understand, because of the nature of your work, that I'm not allowed to discuss whether you are actually or have been a spy in the past. I'm not allowed to discuss the possibility you may have trained spies. So we're going to gloss over that and go straight into the fact that people are fascinated by fictional accounts of spies and spying. The James Bond series is one of the most profitable film franchises ever. And there's some of the books that you mention in your book, there's Le Carré and other authors. So first of all, why do you think psychologically the public are so interested in spies and spying stories?
Well, Raj, I have to say, you're the psychologist, as is Adrian, which is why I write the book with Adrian. I mean, my own personal view, which is not a professional psychologist view by any means, but it is, I think there's an intrigue. It's got all the makings of a good story. If you look at how to tell a good story, there's so many possibilities in that. Trust, betrayal, people believing something that it's not always the case. And then you can always throw in the guns and the chases, and that's it's a natural platform for exciting stories. I think, sadly, from my point of view, very few of them actually get to the real personality, the motivation. But that's me as a professional talking. I mean, I'm looking forward to the next James Bond as well as much as the next one.
So you mentioned trust and betrayal. So speaking as a psychiatrist, I think those are two key words here in terms of the public fascination, because I believe that one of the most wounding experiences any of us can have in our lives is a betrayal of some description. And to some extent, we all have been betrayed, maybe by friends, a colleague, a boss who promised us a pay rise, and then nothing happened, or someone got promoted over us. In an intimate relationship, being dumped can feel like a betrayal. But trust, we need to trust people, we need to relax and give over this important thing, trust. And who do we trust? Trump famously said in an interview with the BBC very recently, I don't trust anyone. I'm paraphrasing what he said. But
I remember the interview.
It was a very revealing statement, right? So let's talk a bit about that, because spies have to do this thing. They have to build trust, and also they're in the heart of betrayal. So let's talk a bit about that, because actually it's in everyday life.
It is as well, and yes, I could relate to it in my own experience, but just in business sense or work sense. I think I'd like to therefore separate it out, if I may, the person who is doing the betraying, that is the agent, and spy is a generic word, it covers everything. But the agent is the person who is betraying their country, Russia, or their organization, be it a terrorist organization. They want to betray it, and our fascination, or the fascination, why would they betray it? But as far as an intelligence officer, that is the case handler, is concerned, they have to bridge that gap of being trustworthy, because this person, the agent, is putting their lives literally in the hands of the case officer. And that is something that, a lot of time, and I've spent a lot of time training people, how to develop trust, how to develop liking, how to develop affection. It's not always essential, but trust certainly is.
And often the betrayal that happens in terms of when someone turns and becomes a spy, you guys, I mean, that in the broadest sense of the word, are very good at exploiting simmering resentment, of which there's a lot of. We're upset with our workplaces. We're upset with things which make us think when someone comes along and gives us an opportunity to betray our country or our organization, I'm going to stick it to them. In other words, there's an untapped anger within all of us that spies exploit.
And I certainly think that resentment, disenchantment, I mean, the deep psychological phrase you'll be familiar with is being pissed off with something. That is, to my mind, it's a core element. But there are other elements. The reasons for people betraying their country or the organization are multifaceted. I don't want to say it's complex, because everybody likes to say it's complex. It's actually quite simple, and you can sort of say, but the relationship that the individual has with their employer is critical. So just to give you an example, there I was in Geneva, and there'd be lots of cocktail parties, drinks parties around the UN. If I met a Chinese or a Russian and they said what a wonderful person the ambassador is, fine, I'll move on. But if I meet someone who's, I've had an awful day, I really haven't enjoyed my day-to-day, and I then find out why, and it was because he'd been badly treated, vanity had been, then he's got a friend, and I will then speak to him. So that is one of the key things that we look for. But also, we do look at their personality. Are they suitable? Are they capable of taking pressure? Can they manage the pressure? Are they bright enough? Because some of the things we ask them to do, they've got to remember. They can't write notes. So they've got to be intelligent. They've got to be conscientious. They've got to be stable. All of the things you'll be very familiar with. And I remember when Adrian first came across it, we talked to him, and we used words like ego and vanity. And Adrian was very clever, and he just said, absolutely right. I mean, we psychologists use different words, but you're very close. And he was able, though, to give us a sort of more scientific structure to how we assess potential agents. And then the third element is the relationship with the case officer. So those three elements, but you're absolutely right, Raj, that resentment, the disenchantment is, I think, common. And in the 12 case studies we produce, it existed.
So you're at a cocktail party in Geneva or somewhere else, you're chatting away to people, and you've got to, first of all, have an antennae open to spotting the person who's not looking like the happiest person in the room, right? So you hone in on that. So the first step, which is very important in everyday amateur psychology, that I think most people are bad at, is noticing people properly, observing them properly, and how happy are they? I don't even think people ask that question, right? No. And it's a crucial question because next step is the person who is upset, and people are likely to be upset. There are all sorts of upsetting things that happen at work or in your marriage or whatever. Detect the upset and then be a shoulder to cry on. Be interested in people's upset and be a listening ear. This is very powerful. And I like to coin a catchphrase, which is everyone thinks it's love that makes the world go round. No. It's hatred. It's hatred that makes the world go round. And you guys exploit that, right?
Well,
over to you.
Fine. Okay, well, let me go back just one stage. Because there is one thing that's really important, which is why this discussion is fascinating to me, and I always enjoy it, as would anybody from my background. And that is, the first thing we look for is, do they have access to secret intelligence?
Of course, right.
But it's absolutely critical, because when you're employed in a job, you join, the government or Lloyd's or something like that, you go through all sorts of psychometric tests and interviews. Are you a suitable person? Are you bright enough for all of that? We don't have that. What we have is somebody who has access to intelligence. They could be the most awful person, or be really difficult in some way, but that is of no concern. We have to assess that person, just as you say. We have to look at them, we have to listen to them, and you're absolutely right. I remember when I first got involved in this, it was thought that the big charismatic person, the person who would go in, big personality, sweep people off their feet with their charm and everything else, and that was the way to recruit agents. Actually, that's not the way. It's just as you said, the more introvert character, often, I'm not, so you could say, but the more introvert, the more listening, caring person is often a better source handler than, 50 years ago, the person who go sweeping in. Everybody liked talking to him, being part of it.
So access, let's talk a bit about that, because in fact there has been a newspaper story about someone who was a bit delusional perhaps about wanting to become a spy, right? And it turned out they really didn't have access to what was needed. So people can be a bit delusional because like everyone wants to be James Bond, okay? But you've got to have access, and you've got to spot the ones who actually do have access as opposed to the ones who claim. Now sometimes it could be someone quite low down, a secretary, right, or a receptionist or a courier actually has access and actually has much more access than even they may realize they have, right? So there's that element as well.
Sure, there is. And I mean, I can't remember all 7, but I remember when during training, and we have a thing, there are those that we go out and at the cocktail party and we meet them and then we try and influence them and persuade them and things like that. But most, is it right that most, many of the really, really successful agents are those who come and what we call, say, offer their services. So we haven't gone and they just come. Now, there are 7 reasons, and I can't remember all 7, so don't press me on all 7, but one of them is the Walter Mitty character. People who just want to get involved in this world, they think they're delusional, they've got themselves worked up, I know this Russian, he lives next door to me. So what is what I would say, but they sort of make it up as a thing. So Walter Mitty is one. One is it could be the Russians who are trying to flush you out. It could be a journalist.
Could be a double agent.
It could be a double agent.
Yes,
exactly.
yes,
All of those things, and one of them is a genuine person, and that is the most difficult thing to identify. And also, people like Oleg Gordievsky, who passed away, but perhaps one of the most significant spies of the last century, agents. And he was a Russian, came to be head of the KGB in the London residency here. I mean, he virtually offered his services. But the first time he did it? He did it in 1968 when Russian Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia. And he thought, he picked up the phone, spoke to his wife, knowing that the phone was, the day he was in Denmark at the time, Danish Security Service would be listening to him. And he said, what the Soviet Union has just done is terrible, it's awful, it's bad, blaspheming, everything bad, and then sat back waiting for the Danish PET security service to come along. They never did, they were too busy with other things. But very interesting feature of Russians, they're very long-term in their thinking. 1969, he went back to Moscow, 1973, came back to Copenhagen, and we suddenly thought, that looks, because they had the records. And then the Danes turned to the Brits and said, would we help? And we did. So those sorts of offers of service are very important. We have to be sensitive, and just as you say, Raj, we have to be able to make an assessment of them, and do they have real intelligence?
Yes. So that again, listening carefully to conversation is, I think most people don't do. And as a psychiatrist, I believe one of the reasons I'm fascinated to talk to you is I believe we're all spies in a sense, right? And I'll explain what I mean by that. All of us are amateur spies. We're all trying to get intelligence about what's going on. Let's say you want a pay rise, or you want to date a girl, and her friends are telling you a bit about her. You're gathering intelligence. So the ability to gather information and then, I'm going to use a dark word here, exploit it, or manipulate people around you, get the boss to give you a pay rise. This is all what spies do, right? In a professional sense.
I was giving I was running a training course not far from an NGO, and the NGO looks after waste when ships break up and there's waste. And these young things, because these people have to go off at a moment's notice, so they tend to be very young. Straight out geologists, very good. But they arrive, and there's some crusty old brigadier in charge of the harbour. How do they get it? And I said at the opening meeting, so I'm going to help you manipulate. And the CEO said, John, we don't manipulate. We're an NGO. We are very on. We don't manipulate. I said, okay, I'll put that word to the side, I'll find another word. But by the end, he saw exactly what we're doing. All of the things about influencing people, about befriending people, and being convincing and creating that trust. And I think trust, they will be able to trust us genuinely. But some of the other bits about, being likable, and all of those things, there's quite a bit of manipulation going on there.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you a micro version of gathering intelligence in the everyday world to use as a small example. So I got hauled in a long time ago, yet again, by the president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists to tell me off over something I'd said on television or radio. They kept doing it, yes, because I was popular, and that was not popular at some of these august medical ancient institutions. So I'm sitting in the waiting room or the reception area, trying to figure out what am I going to get told off about, or what is the meeting about, because I'd like to get some intelligence. So the secretary was sitting in the room, right? So I began to banter with the secretary, okay? And by bantering with the secretary, she turned out she was a big fan of some of the TV shows I'd done. And the fact she, first of all, exhibited her fandom and wanted to chat with me in a very positive, light-hearted way, gave me intelligence, because I knew she was a witness to the big man's view on me, right? And she wouldn't be bantering me in this way if he was like furious with me and thought I was persona non grata. She would have kept herself to herself, right? That revealed something about what was going on in his head. I could glean from gathering intelligence about her attitude to me. So I believe that's an example of some of the skills that you guys deploy that ordinary people tend not to think hard about. And in other words, they're ways of getting at information.
No, you're absolutely right. I'm only sort of trying to think of other examples, but very much so. So you will talk to other people about your main target, as well as observing if I use the word target, but the principal object of our exploration. And we'll watch them. We'll watch them with their bosses or their work colleagues, and with their family if we ever get to see them. And it's not because we're looking for, and I really this is really important to me, we're not looking for reasons to coerce them. Coercion is not part of our lexicon certainly in the UK. I'd like to say it universally about Western democracies. I think there have been some failings, and back in the 70s, the British government failed as well. Not so the Russians and the Chinese, but coercion, that is acquiring information again that somebody's having an affair or is fraudulent or whatever. I mean, we may well record it, but we would not use it in order to recruit them. And there are two reasons. One, it's unethical, and I wouldn't want to be part of a service that did that. But of course, that doesn't go down very well when you're in, I was about to name a country, but in the middle of Africa, let's say, where clearly they do use coercion. So I use this second argument, which it doesn't work. Coercion is really inefficient. And what's more, the person you're putting pressure on, they want the pressure to go off. So they'll tell you what they believe you want to hear. So they get the information you get is rubbish as well. So I use the second argument when I'm away from here, but it's really important to us.
Yeah, okay. Let's go over some terms, though,
yeah,
right? Like intelligence officer,
Yep.
agent,
Yes.
and agent handler.
Yep.
Because one of your criticisms of fictionalized accounts of spying is they neglect the role of the ancient handler.
Yeah.
So what is an intelligence officer, what is an agent, and what is an agent handler?
To be a bit more specific, my criticism of fiction mostly is that there's very little work done on the agent. Alan Judd is an exception to that, Legacy and things like that. But most fiction, certainly Le Carré, James Bond, obviously, they're all talking about the spy masters, the intelligence officer, the agent handler. There isn't much difference between an intelligence officer and an agent handler. They're roughly, they are the same thing. An intelligence officer is a case handler, as is an analyst, as is thing. So again, intelligence officer is a bit of a generic term. That the case handler, the source handler, they're the ones who go out and meet the potential agents or run the agents.
And turn the agent. Convince the agent to start spying.
We use the word recruit. But
right, yes, okay. But that's a very important point, which is that you've got the handler who turns the person, and their relationship becomes very, very important.
Very.
Okay, right.
In the beginning.
Yeah.
Because clearly, when you're at that critical moment, you're sitting with this potential agent, and you say, there's something I want to tell you, something I must inform you, and we want to work together, and I'm going to give you this sort of... So how have you managed the recruitment that's done that way? But as soon as you have recruited someone, you then move in, and this is quite difficult, you move into the professional, because they're working not for me, they're working for the organisation and the British government in the bigger sense. So you have to turn that away, because in 2 years' time, I leave the post, I move on, and somebody has to come in.
But that's when it can become problematic.
Yes,
because often the relationship's very intense and very personal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you guys do psychological analyses of world leaders, and there's a very interesting psychological analysis in this book on Putin, okay? And you do a psychological analysis of Putin, and you compare him to Adolf Hitler, Saddam Hussein, and the North Korean leader, okay? And you mention some key personality traits that recur again and again. Sadism, delighting in being awful to people or inducing suffering, and then there's paranoia, okay, and also narcissism. Okay, so you mentioned those three. You didn't mention psychopathy, if memory serves.
It does get a. It does get a.
Okay.
It's antisocial psychopathy. It's in there in a sense, and whether you make it. And yes, you're quite right. And can I explain why I think it's important?
Yeah.
Because as well as being fascinated and being part of the intelligence world, I'm obviously been interested in geopolitics. I served in Moscow for 2 years. I've worked on China and things like that. And I remember in Moscow when I was there in the 70s, you'd see the Soviet leaders going down at 100 kilometers an hour down in their big black hills. And there was one man called Mikhail Suslov, who was the ideologue. He was the one who kept the Communist Party absolutely right. He drove with the curtains back at 50 kilometers an hour, no outriders, and he sat bolt upright so everybody could see him. And you saw that man, and you knew that Leonid Brezhnev, Kosygin, Gromyko, whoever, there was somebody in the background who was advising them, saying, no, you can't do that, or you can do that. Now, they still did awful things, I'm not saying, but you don't have that now in Putin. Putin is an autocrat. He is a single person and nothing happens. Therefore, I can't tell you how many times I've misjudged Russian intentions. We had a bit of intelligence, well, the Americans and others had intelligence that Putin was going to invade Ukraine in 22. But he took that decision himself. Now, you can look at the advice he was getting. And that's why I think it's beholden not on amateurs like me, but people like you, Raj, and Adrian, and others, to advise political leaders, whatever your analysts are saying, your geopolitical analysts are saying, Putin is going to respond like this to this action. That's way beyond Donald Trump, because he's a narcissist and thinks he can do the whole thing himself. But we should be much brighter and cleverer than that. And that's why I wrote that piece with Adrian, obviously. And yes, there is a comparison to be made with Hitler, and said, it's in there more to shock and say, hang on a minute, do you realize what you're working with here? Because if you just come up with psychological words like paranoia and narcissism, they will sort of say, oh, perhaps, their eyes will film over. But if you say you are dealing with someone like Hitler, who is an autocrat, therefore you have to take this study, and that's why people like you and Adrian are so important.
So you're saying Putin is a bit like Hitler, and therefore that's important because of what happened with Hitler, and there's a world war. Yeah. So you're linking the idea of a world war then with Putin, and you're making a link with his personality.
Yes.
The fact there's a similar personality. There's a paranoia, and sadism, and narcissism.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Putin himself was a spy. He was working at KGB. Yeah. So tell us a bit about that bit, because that's important.
Yes, it is.
In terms of your understanding of how he might operate today.
And I think I'll certainly talk about that. There's also the bigger picture of Russia. Russia is, generally speaking, paranoid. I mean, Russians they think the world is against them. So he is part of, it's just that he takes it to another level. Putin grew up in Leningrad, parents loved him. His parents both were not well. He lived on the 5th floor, one room, shared toilet. I mean, things that to us would be awful and appalling, but were standard in those days, in the early 50s. And he was a small man, and he was often bullied, and he learned how to respond. He got into fights. He was quite an aggressive type. He talks about this, and there's lots of evidence about it as well. On the paranoia, there's just one little thing that is a story of his which may be indicative. I don't want to go from a small thing into a big thing, but he was once chasing a rat in the back streets of Leningrad, and this rat was cornered. And Putin was about to kill the rat, but the rat didn't. He came out and attacked. And that's how Putin sees much of his world. If you are cornered or if there's a lot of pressure on you, you don't give way, you attack. So anyway, Putin he became fascinated because of a film. I can't remember the name of the film, but anyway, because of a film.
The Sword and the Shield.
Yes, that's the one.
Or the
well
Shield
done, Raj.
Or the
well
Shield
done.
and the Sword.
Yes,
I think about
whichever one it was. It's that one.
Yeah.
Well done. And anyway, he said he wanted to join. But he went to Leningrad University. How? Because he wasn't the brightest of students at school. But anyway, went to Leningrad and then joined the KGB in Leningrad. Now, all the top ones go to Moscow. They go to Gimo in Moscow and to other places, not many others. And Moscow is the center, obviously, and it's a very centralized country. But no, and then he gets a foreign posting, and he goes to Dresden, Eastern Germany. This is hardly a high-flying officer. Then 1990 comes and the Soviet Union collapses. And then he uses his skills that he's learned in the KGB, information collecting, which is what these Germans did all the time, collecting information, manipulating people, so how you use that information, how you develop relationships which are important. So all of those things he learned. And he did that, and he got into the mayor of St. Petersburg, or was Leningrad, is now St. Petersburg, and then went to join the KGB, became head of the FSB, the Internal Service. Yeltsin picked him up through one of the oligarchs, and then got himself into a position, but really by manoeuvring and cleverness, not by any innate brilliance as a case officer or things. But he's a KGB officer, as Colin Powell said famously when he said, I think Bush said, I see a man I can trust, and Colin Powell said, I see a KGB officer.
Yeah, but you guys have emphasized a lot in the book this notion of intelligence, right? Yeah. But I'm interested in that because whatever we may think about him IQ-wise, you place a lot of weight on his educational background. Yes, yeah. He must be an operator of some description.
Absolutely.
And that, to try and capture that with a model seems difficult. There seems to me, you talk about the fact that all the great spies through history have had tough childhoods, okay?
Most, yes.
Yeah, and maybe some link with that. And there seems to be a very interesting psychological link with Donald Trump, who had a bit of a tough childhood, perhaps. Yes. There's some controversy about his background. But also, Putin seems to be very good at selling a lie. Okay, and quite up for it in some way, and maybe thinks that's part of what life is. Now, I don't want to get into trouble with Trump supporters, but many people would say there's a similarity with the psychology of these two individuals, and they are meant to like each other theoretically. Anyway, over to you in terms of your thoughts about that.
I mean, there's so much in there, but anyway, Trump, yes, sort of got to the stage where he felt he liked Putin and felt he could trump Putin. The reverse was never the case. Putin was much smarter in terms of assessing Trump. I mean, when his Trump special advisor went to Moscow the first time in January this year, what did Putin do? He had Russia's best artist paint a portrait of Donald Trump. And that was a gift to pass on. I mean, playing on Trump's narcissism, which is... anyway, and I think that Putin is playing that much more cleverly than President Trump is. And I think that, I'm not saying that he has psychological background, but I think the other thing about Russians, I think I mentioned already, there's a sort of level of paranoia amongst them. And they do feel that they the world is against them. It's easy to tell them that, and of course they don't have access to information.
But do you not think in both cases, and going back to the psychology of spying, having a sense of what people want to hear, whether it's the truth or not, is a whole other thing. Having a sense of what people want to hear and being able to supply it is a key skill today that I think both of those two people we're talking about, Putin and Trump, have. And I believe that if you're really attached to the truth, it becomes more difficult, even if you're being manipulative, when you're departing from the truth and trying to sell a story which you know isn't true, but you're trying to convince people. So I think there's an issue which is for them, what can I get people to believe? What do people want to believe is much more the territory they're in. And I think spies are in that territory.
To a certain extent, Millard. I think.
Okay.
I mean, we know that Putin, when he invaded Ukraine, his intelligence services, the SVR and the FSB, and it was principally the FSB, the internal service, even though Ukraine was not part of Russia, they were telling Putin what he wanted to hear. Absolutely true. And I think that those, well, particularly now, Trump will be being advised by people who know what he wants to hear, and they'll be going. And he has disassociated himself from the CIA. And just to give a little story, I mean, I remember we were running a case against Russia, Soviet Union, and we were producing intelligence which said that our whole strategic approach to conventional war in Europe was wrong. Basically, our tanks were rubbish, their tanks were great. I mean, you can pick more detail there. And, of course, we shared this with the Americans, CIA and Pentagon. And eventually they said, no, this is not true. And they refused. They said, we don't want any more of this reporting. Now, that man eventually defected. And he went over, the first thing we did is send him over to the Pentagon, because we believed him. But because there was there's some things that we pass the important intelligence on, but we don't give them the background or the details. Even the Americans are close to that. And basically, the Americans saw this man and were convinced. But they didn't accept the intelligence because they didn't believe. It wasn't part of the pattern, what they wanted to believe.
Yes.
Their tanks were the best in the world and all that. This is donkeys years ago.
Yeah, but do you not think that's happened with weapons of mass destruction?
Yes.
I don't want to land you in trouble, but the sense in which the intelligence operator or gatherer has to think, what does the Prime Minister want to hear? Because he's already departed down a policy approach. So I will tell him what he wants to hear, and therefore I will keep my job or maybe get promoted. And only 20 years' time when there's an inquiry do we discover it was all rubbish.
Absolutely. And it wasn't all rubbish. I mean, you can put in a defence if you like. But I'm not in that. But, I mean, if you want me to, I will. But no, your basic point is correct. That in the run-up to that Gulf War in 2002-3, at that time, everybody was convinced Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and intelligence that said they did was accepted, and intelligence that said they didn't was sort of passed away. And there was the famous call of Curve, I can't remember his full name, but he's well known. He was an Iraqi. He just lied to the Germans and said...
Because it was in his interest to do it.
Oh,
he got a lot of attention.
A lot of attention, and he wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein because he had resentment against Saddam Hussein.
Yes,
but no, that information, and he was an offer of service.
Yes.
Kerbal was the name of the...
Yeah, so think hard about motivation.
Yep.
And a Prime Minister should be thinking, the intelligence service seems to be telling me what I want to hear. Yeah. What is their motivation? So this is a key point.
Yes, it is. But we're dealing in politicians, and we have to then look at each politician. Some politicians have been better at this, challenging the intelligence services, saying to the intelligence, I want to hear the truth. I don't want just to hear what others think is the right thing to say. So there are prime ministers like that, but there are some who, you could see, and you can see heads of intelligence service not manipulating, but saying, I really want the Prime Minister to be pleased with me, and therefore give him what he wants. It is a real danger.
Okay.
And we can talk about each case individually, and there are nuances to each case.
Right, so you're going to run screaming from the room at the next topic I'm going to pick, which is, and feel free to do so, which is we're discussing the fact that spot where people are unhappy, and that's where you may be able to exploit the unhappiness. Well, a lot of people, sorry to be blunt here, are unhappy in their intimate lives, or unhappy with their marriages, okay? So the honey trap, right? You send in some gorgeous girl, and the guy gets more attention than he's used to. And I have much clinical experience in the situation that men in a West End bar find it hard to think of the more obvious reason why a young attractive woman might come onto them suddenly out of the blue. They can't seem to click. There may be an agenda here, and they fall for this over and over again. Men are vulnerable, particularly, I think, but women are vulnerable as well. But anyway, so there wasn't that much about the honey trap here, but surely it exists, and it's a big vulnerability, and it operates in the world of spies.
It exists. I have never been involved in a honey trap operation or heard of a serious honey trap operation. Of course, I don't, but that's where, we out of the blue send in an attractive man or attractive. The East Germans were very good. They had a thing called a Romeo and Juliet program, and the East German service would send people to NATO, Brussels, and they would just have these really good-looking men and women who would go around the bars and try and pick up young secretaries and male officers. So it does work both ways, but classically, the Mata Haris and all the rest of it. But of course, relationship sex rears its head, and you've got to be very practical about it. But you certainly don't use it. I mean, okay, just to satisfy you things. So I remember we were looking into a case of a communist working in London, and he was wandering around, and he obviously was interested in women, Western women. And so we used that in order to attract him into our purview. But the women concerned never had anything more than half a dozen words with him. Then we had a man who talked to him, and the case was successful. But we did ask the question of ourselves, if we recruit him, which we did, what do we do if he says he wants a woman? And that was quite a hard question. It never did, but we had to go through the intellectual thing of that. But he never did. But it's never happened. But of course we're aware of it.
Well, one of the most famous cases in British political history, the Profumo scandal, is about an idea, something to do with this, right? That there was an attractive woman, Christine Keeler, involved, and she was the girlfriend or sleeping with, I think, the Russian attaché. So there was a sense in which that was a problem.
Yes, as I say, sex is a wonderful head, and it's there, and you just have to be very practical. In our world, you have to be very practical. And again, go back to a point I made earlier, this is something that we in our world do not get involved in. Of course, the Russians do. I mean, when I was in Moscow, in the embassy in Moscow, there was more than 3 or 4 occasions when embassy officials would be traveling around the Soviet Union, and they would fall into conversation, their drinks would be spiked, they'd wake up in the morning with a beautiful woman by their bed. And it was a very simple thing. They flew straight back to Moscow, went straight to the ambassador, didn't go into the safe speech room. In his office, which obviously had bugs in it, he said, "Mr. Ambassador, I'm really sorry, I have to report that I woke up this morning with drugged and I'm feeling with a dreadful headache. And there was this woman lying next to me." And so it was openly admitted. The ambassador, and that's how management should be. No blame, you're not at fault. Really sorry, do you want to go back and talk to your wife? Do you need time? All of those things to be discussed. But are very practical, but no repercussions on their thing. Of course, if they didn't go back, and homosexuality, oh God, I've forgotten his name.
Philby?
No, he wasn't. Well, he might have been, but I don't know if he was. Vassal.
Yeah.
Vassal, he was homosexual and was trapped. But, going back to your very first point, he was really, again, I was going to use that psychological word, he was deeply resentful of his seniors in the embassy in Moscow. He was gay. It was illegal at that time,
Yeah.
and the Russians got hold of it. They put a pole in, actually, along beside him. But do you know what was clever? I mean, the KGB were, and I think still are, very clever, because they turned that initial pressure on and then built up his vanity. Well, I mean, he was vain already, built up his thing, and said, you are good, you are a brilliant man. And they continued to run him back when he came back to London, because they recognised that the blackmail is a very short-term thing.
Yeah.
So they turned it, basically. But yes, they would use it.
So going back to the case you said where the guy wakes up with a beautiful woman in the bedroom and he's
Yep.
been drugged, and he goes straight back to headquarters
Yep.
in another country and lays it all out on purpose because he knows he's being bugged
Yes.
by the people who put the woman
Yep.
in the bed.
Yep.
So he's kind of sending a message, which
Yes,
is, you haven't got a
absolutely.
weapon on me because I've
Yep.
come clean about
Yep.
it, so you
Yep.
can't. Okay, right, okay. So basically, spies, thrillers, and James Bond, and Ian Fleming, and Le Carré are popular, but they're about the wrong thing. They're about action
Yeah.
and maybe technology, but actually what spying is really about is the darker recesses of the human mind, getting a sense of what that is, getting a handle on it, and exploiting it.
Yeah.
And those books are not about that.
No, no. But what they
Because that's not so watchable, perhaps. But to me,
Well,
it's more interesting.
It's much more interesting, and as you know, I've written that book, I've written 3 or 4 other books, but I have in mind a fiction, but it is so much more difficult writing fiction than this sort of practical book.
Yeah.
And yes, and the book that I want to write about is actually seen from the point of view of the agent. And everything starts with the agent, because it's all about the resentment, the disenchantment, and relationships. And yeah, because it's a book, it's a fiction, it's got to sell, so there will be a bit of chasing around, and there'll be a bit of sex. And I mean, I'm not going to describe a sex scene, but there will be relationship issues. But there aren't really those sorts of books. So it's an aspect of it. But, it's the case officer who is a sort of James Bond, or a more cerebral George Smiley, or others. One of the interesting things, though, about it is that I find some of the screen portrayals of these much more interesting, because when you saw Richard Burton play the spy, I can't remember his name, the main man in Spy who came in from the cold and Le Carré novel. When you see Alec Guinness playing George Smiley, you see it is so much more powerful than the book. And when you see the way that those brilliant actors can get over the emotion, they're much better at it than the written word. And now, you could say, well, John, that's your very anti-intellectual way. But it is. I've spent a lot of time reading the novels and the bit where Le Carré tries to explain the motivation, and he doesn't. In Hayden, he just said, when they were interviewing him, the interviewers came to George Smiley and said, well, he won't talk about his motivation. Look, John Le Carré was a member of MI5 and a member of MI6. If you knew anything about the business, that's the fascinating thing. Why did Hayden work for the KGB? And that's just not covered adequately. Sorry.
Okay, so one final question, a tough question. Again, you may run screaming from the room. I did a BBC programme a long time ago on what we're going to call the paedophile unit for the police. And they spend a lot of time having to watch terrible stuff and, go out and arrest these people. But it left them psychologically altered in that they couldn't trust anyone. So if they heard that their 5-year-old came from school and said, oh, there's a new PE teacher, but they were immediately on it, like, who is this guy? What's his background? They would do background checks, right? So they were vigilant in a way that the rest of us are slightly more not vigilant about. So it had changed them, and they couldn't relax, particularly when their children were involved. Has it changed you? Does it change Spies? So that, for example, you're always assessing people, spotting their vulnerability, seeing where they might be exploitable. You're not going to go and do it in your personal life, but you're not able to necessarily just have a relationship with someone at a dinner party. You're constantly spotting their vulnerability, etc., etc. Tough question, I appreciate
No,
that.
I don't think it is, because, well, it isn't for me. I do see some colleagues who are very wrapped up in the business and they still can't sort of relax. They're always, who are they reporting to and things like that. I think, when I came out of Moscow, every room in the flat had not only microphones in them, but video cameras. And that was, so, and we saw the KGB officer coming in and out of the morning and the afternoon, collecting and delivering tapes. So the KGB know everything about me. And do you know what? I don't care, because it's sort of, I went over the hill, as it were. But I do find, because I've written a book like that, and then I'm friends with Adrian, and I often talk about you as well, Raj. And people say, oh, well, you're assessing me, aren't you? You know what? I'm not. Life is too short to go around. And I don't know, I mean, I could ask the same question of you, Raj. I mean, you're much better, you're skilled at this, you're enormously qualified at this. Do you go to a dinner party and sort of start assessing others, or do you relax?
No, I relax because I have other things I want to do in the relationship, like tell a joke, or get people to like me, or play tennis with them.
Yes.
There's another agenda,
Totally
which
agree.
if you were constantly thinking what's deeply going on with this person, you would not have time to have fun with people.
Well, I'm with you.
Yeah.
But, okay, so I don't.
All right. Well, John Taylor, thank you very much indeed for talking to us about your fascinating book, The Psychology of Spies and Spying.
Thank you,
The
Raj.
story of the real James Bond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raj. Very good. Thank you.